Well, welcome to our side event and great event on Leave No One Behind Education, Right to Education of Persons with Disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. I am very glad that we are all here together for 14th session of the Conference of States Parties to the CRPD. My name is Youngyeon and Kim. My honor to be today's MC. I work as an activist at REDRIC. REDRIC stands for Research Institute of the Differently Abled Persons' Rights in Korea. We are so pleased to be joined today by Permanent Mission of Republic of Korea to the UN, CRPD NGO Coalition of Republic of Korea, DPI Korea, Korea Center for United Nations Human Rights Policy, the Indigo, and REDRIC, along with co-sponsorship on this event by Permanent Mission of Uganda to the UN, Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, International Disability Alliance, and White Cane. Once again, we are very delighted to have all of you here with us. Before moving into the discussion with our distinguished panelists today, I would like to share some general housekeeping guidelines with everyone. The basic guideline is similar to the existing webinar. As you can see on the screen, all attendees' microphones and cameras are automatically off during the event. Only panelists have their microphones and cameras on when we ask their speech. Of course, we provide sign language interpreters, as you can see. If you don't see our sign language interpreters right next to me, then you might need to swipe left from the active speaker view or select the gallery view or gallery mode. Captions for this event are also available by clicking the CC button, which is also found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The chat box, I believe, will be used only to panelists in order to communicate with our staff. So please give your attention when you receive the message, all panelists, please. And if any attendees have some questions, there is a Q&A box in your Zoom screen at the bottom of your black navigation panel. So you're very welcome to leave the questions through the Q&A box, and the questions are exposed to the staff only. So I will try to reserve some time at the end to addressing the questions. Okay, so please let us thank to our sign language interpreters and simultaneous interpreters throughout this event for their support, as well as our staff team at the back. You could always choose the option translation, and we provide Korean and English at the same time. I want to let everyone know that the session today is being recorded. It will be made available on the social media channels of REDRIC and DPI Korea in a few days. Okay, now I think I have provided all the necessary guidelines, and we're just about to start our journey for an hour. But we can't start it without addressing the purpose of today's event, right? Article 24 of the CRPD recognized the right of persons with disabilities to education without discrimination and on the basis of equal opportunity. However, in reality, pandemic magnified many challenges of education for those children with disabilities, such as difficulties to access school materials due to distance learning policies. Many children with disabilities are still excluded from education measures of COVID-19. So, through this event, we will discuss and share efforts and measures to ensure the rights to education of persons with disabilities taken by all of us here, so that we can come up with specific practices to make sure leave no one behind in education, even in this difficult situation like COVID-19. Okay, let me be quiet for now, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ambassador
해주실 연사분을 모시겠습니다.
Representative of the Republic of Korea to the UN. He is here to give us a welcome statement for today's event. So, Ambassador Jo Hyun, thank you very much for being with us. The microphone is all yours.
Hi there. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome all of you to today's virtual side event on the margin of the 14th session of the Conference of State Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Ambassador Hebert for co-sponsoring this event. My appreciation also goes to the moderator and panelists for leading today's discussions. The pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities across all sectors of life for persons with disabilities and their communities. Even under normal circumstances, the 1 billion persons with disabilities worldwide face high barriers to accessing education, healthcare, and livelihoods, or participating in the communities in all their dimensions. Available data reveals that, on average, 1 in 3 children with disabilities of primary school age is out of school, compared with 1 in 7 children without disabilities. Primary school completion is also lower for children with disabilities. The impact of lost education for children with disabilities is likely to have permanent detrimental effects for many. To avoid losing an entire generation, we must elevate our collective commitment to create an enabling environment for students with disabilities. Schools should be further accessible. Policymakers at the community and national levels should enhance their knowledge on disability inclusion in education. We all need to acknowledge that everyone has unique needs and adopt a learner-centered pedagogy alongside this perspective. Indeed, we should shift from prevention and care-focused approaches to rights-based approaches to fully embrace disability as a part of human diversity. This vision will only be achieved through active consultation with persons with disabilities, their representative organizations, the private sector, and communities of experts. The Republic of Korea, for its part, adopted the 5th Comprehensive Policy Plan for Persons with Disabilities in 2018. The plan aims to create a more inclusive society where persons with disabilities can develop their personality, talents, and abilities to their fullest potential. My delegation is also proud to be co-sponsoring relevant resolutions on the rights of persons with disabilities at the Human Rights Council and at the General Assembly for mainstreaming the rights of persons with disabilities in international discussions on different key subjects, including education. We have also undertaken significant efforts in advancing accessibility in the United Nations system, including by establishing and leading the Steering Committee on Accessibility at the United Nations. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that we have a common responsibility and ambition to build a more inclusive and diverse society where everyone's lives are equally respected. Through this, we can ensure that the vision and the aspiration of persons with disabilities are included and accounted for in a disability inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. Realizing the rights of persons with disabilities is crucial to fulfilling the core promise of 2030 agenda. That is, to leave no one behind. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful opening remarks for our event. Thank you so much, Ambassador Jo Han. And for the second welcome message, it was supposed to be from the permanent mission of Uganda to the UN, but I think they are not still here yet for the urgent situation. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Ms. Kim Mi-yeon, Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Let's welcome Ms. Kim Mi-yeon, and the microphone is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kim. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, and ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to side event. I'm Mi-yeon Kim, a Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. First of all, I would like to express my special thanks to Permanent Mission of Republic of Korea to the UN, Permanent Mission of Uganda to the UN, Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and International Disability Alliance and White King, UN CRPD NGO Coalition of the Republic of Korea, Korea Center for United Nations Human Rights Policy, Research Institute of the Differently Abled Persons' Rights in Korea, and the Indigo for organizing and supporting this wonderful event. Also, I would like to highly appreciate Ambassador Jo Hyun and Deputy Ambassador Palib Odida Abare having given us warm welcoming. And I would like to welcome and thanks to my colleague, the Chair of Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Ms. Rosemary Cases. Especially thanks to the Madam Chin Hye-soo, a chair of board of Kokun and the member of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights for moderating today. We have the distinguished panelists as well. Mrs. Sylvia Khan, my colleague, former vice chair of the CRPD committee, Mr. Kim Mi-yeon, Mrs. Elizabeth Luabu, Mr. Olga Kopasiko-Chov, and Mr. Pue Tiering. I am looking forward to fruitful sharing of you all. Ladies and gentlemen, nearly 50% of children with disabilities are not in school, compared to only 13% of their peers without disabilities. The Article 24 of CRPD clarifies that State Department must ensure the realizing of the rights of persons with disabilities to education through an inclusive education system at all levels. Also, Sustainable Development Goal 4 affirms that the value of inclusive, quality, and equitable education. I believe that inclusion is the key to achieving the rights to education for persons with disabilities, particularly post-COVID-19. Inclusive education will be central to the achieving high-quality education for all learners, including those with disabilities, and for the development of inclusive, peaceful, and fair societies. COVID-19 pandemic has seized our daily life. The program and devices for online education are inaccessible, so that youth and the children with disabilities are increasingly marginalized in COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, education is essential, which cannot be seized for the future generation, especially for children with disabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that today's event will be a constructive and fruitful event that contributes to building back better by realizing the inclusive education of children with disabilities and post-COVID-19. I sincerely appreciate your interest and contribution for the rights to education of persons with disabilities in these exceptional and challenging circumstances. I extend my best wishes to all of you for a successful and productive side event. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate your presence, Ms. Kim Mi-yeon. And also thank you very much for grounding this event in the core focus on inclusive education that we are all collectively involved in. Okay, I think welcome message from the permanent mission of Uganda to the UN still have difficulties to access our side event. So for now, why don't we go over for the keynote speech? So I would like to, for the keynote speaker, I would like to introduce Ms. Rosemary Kayes. She is the chair of Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Ms. Rosemary Kayes specially sent us her speech via video. So let's go ahead and switch the spotlight. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rosemary Kayes, Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Inclusive education is education for all in one system. Its focus is not disability, but the recognition of human diversity and the benefits to all when that diversity is valued and difference is accommodated in practice. The education system is not only about what is taught in a curriculum or course. It's not just about learning skills and facts. Education is made up of formal, informal, incidental, and vicarious learning that goes beyond the facts to attitudes and values that inherently shape an individual's understanding and expectations of life. The school is one of the first of its community. Inclusive education, by its very nature, underscores the universality of human rights and the inherent dignity and worth of all members of the human family. People with disability have been consistently denied equal access to education and the opportunity for lifelong learning. In all parts of the world, people with disability are frequently excluded from education on the basis of disability or afforded greatly inferior education experiences to those of their peers without disability. In particular, too often those education opportunities that are provided to people with disability are provided in environments where students are segregated and congregated away from their peers without disability in either special schools or special units or classes in mainstream schools. This greatly diminishes the social development of all students, those with disabilities and those without. It is common that these environments provide very poor quality curricula and instructional methods, greatly curtailing students' academic development and achievement. This experience of inequality and discrimination has been exacerbated by COVID-19, which has left students with disabilities even more isolated and with even less support, information and resources. In many countries, the concept of inclusive education challenges accepted ways of doing things, which are often based in prejudice, ignorance, outmoded laws and cultural practices, established patterns of educational and social welfare thinking that are hard to change. The CRPD provides the implementation framework for states parties to build back better and to leave no one behind in fulfilling the right to education. States parties need to move away from maintaining and fostering segregated education systems and embrace the contemporary principles and standards of the CRPD. The standards and principles of equality and non-discrimination in the CRPD affirm the long-held principle in international human rights law that segregation is discrimination. This is also reflected in the human rights model of disability, which is embedded in the CRPD. That is, human rights cannot be diminished or denied on the basis of the type or degree of impairment. Schools are often the first institutions that we all encounter and that reflect broadly the society in which we will grow and live. Inclusive education leads to generations for whom the spectrum of human diversity is part of their everyday experience and embedded in their community life. Transitioning to inclusive education allows states to build inclusive societies in which all members enjoy their full human rights, where the full diversity of the human experience is valued, and in which the inherent dignity of the individual is respected. I wish you all the very best for this side event, and I look forward to hearing about its outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Rosemary Kayes. As Ms. Rosemary said, yes, schools are the first institutions that we all encounter and that reflect the society in which we will grow and live. So yes, inclusive education is very important to us. Great, thank you again for reminding us what is possible and what we should be aiming for. While we are listening to the keynote speech, Ambassador from Uganda has been arrived. Who will give us our welcome message is now supposed to be by Ambassador Adonia Ayabar, the permanent mission of Uganda to the UN, but he conveyed his apologies for not being able to attend because of the urgent business trip. Instead, we have Ambassador Philip Odida, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Uganda to the UN, will give us the welcome speech. Please, I would be really appreciate if you can little shorten the welcome message. Thank you very much. And microphone is all yours now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. First of all, let me apologize for coming in late. It was due to some technical issues and another meeting that engaged me at the last minute. And so my sincere apologies. Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Uganda is pleased to join the co-hosts during this side event on Leave No One Behind in Education at the 14th session of the Conference of Parties to the CRPD. Our special attention goes to the permanent mission of the Republic of Korea to the UN for this important initiative of championing the rights to education to persons with disabilities, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We recognize the role of the United Nations, especially in the implementation of Article 24 of the CRPD, to support and include persons with disabilities on access to education without discrimination and based on equal opportunity. Uganda has embraced inclusive education and has committed itself to ensuring inclusion of persons with disabilities at every level of education. This is evident through our national policy on disability, which aims at promoting and protecting the rights of persons with disabilities under the national constitution, to ensure and empower that equal opportunities for people with disabilities. In this regard, there is a focus on provision of health services, community-based rehabilitation, vocational training, and universal primary education as its key pillars. Our policy commitment is demonstrated by the legal and non-legal frameworks on education, as well as the establishment of educational infrastructure aimed at mainstreaming disability concerns and interventions. So the impact of the above developments is the increasing enrollment of students with disabilities at the primary and secondary level in recent years. However, similar infrastructure is not yet evident at the higher education level. There is need, therefore, for affirmative action on admission of students with disabilities and other marginalized groups to public universities. Madam Chair, the overall goal of the education policy in Uganda is to achieve universal primary education by 2030 under the current National Development Plan. Although access to basic education has risen substantially over the past decade, some children still do not have access to proper schooling, and they leave prematurely or fail to acquire basic skills at completion. So this remains our essential challenge. As I conclude, I would just want to say that Uganda extends its deepest appreciation to the organizers of this side event, in particular, the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations and the Korea Center for United Nations Rights Policy, as well as the various co-sponsors at this session of the Conference of Parties to the CRPD. We focus rightly on the rights of persons with disabilities, particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic. As I recall, at the national level, Uganda has evolved very close bilateral cooperation with Korea since 1963 on a wide range of areas encompassing capacity building, vocational training, agricultural cooperation. My delegation, therefore, looks forward to fruitful deliberations as we extend our cooperation today and into the future. I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Philip Odida. We are so grateful for your presence and your welcome message. Now I'd like to introduce Ms. Shin Hye-soo. Ms. Shin Hye-soo is the chair of the board of Korea Center for United Nations Human Rights Policy. She is also a member of UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So from now on, she will be the moderator of our remaining session. So please enjoy our side event, and let's welcome Ms. Shin Hye-soo. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I think I'm on. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on wherever you are connecting. It is my great pleasure to moderate today's panel at this side event. My name is Hye-soo Shin, and as introduced, I am the chair of the board of the Korea Center for UN Human Rights Policy, KOKUN, and also a member of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I'm happy to say that my committee, CESC, raises the issue of persons with disabilities rights regularly, including the issue of inclusive education, reasonable accommodation, accessibility, or training of teachers, etc. But of course, I will learn more greatly from today's panelists, 5 panelists, who will be presenting various issues of education. They represent different organizations from around the world, as well as from different regions. In the order of first, Mr. Kim Hon-young from Korea, representing the Korea Hamke Union of Disabled Teachers. The second panelist will be Ms. Sylvia Kwan, who is former Vice Chair, Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from Guatemala. And the third panelist will be Ms. Elizabeth Luabu, who is a fellow of representative of International Leaders in Education program from Uganda. And the fourth panelist would be Mr. Oleg Kolpashikov, who is president of the White Cane from Russian Federation. And the fifth panelist is Mr. Pui Kiak Lim. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing your name correct, but Mr. Lim is a board member he'll be joining from Singapore, I believe. We'll be discussing from each panelist for about 7 to 8 minutes. I hope you will not go overboard of the time limit, which will be greatly appreciated. Okay, so the first speaker is Mr. Kim Hon-young, who is the chair of Korea Hamke Union of Disabled Teachers, and he will, of course, explain what Hamke means. So now the floor is yours, Mr. Kim. Can we have Mr. Kim? Okay, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Hon-young Kim. I'm president of Hamke Union of Disabled Teachers in South Korea. Okay. Today I'm going to introduce our organization, the Hamke Union. I'm going to call our union in this shorter version, and then introduce you about what we are doing now. So what gave birth to our union? Before I start, I can guess some of you might be thinking that having a union of disabled people of their own can be a bad thing, because CRPD is all about inclusion, and I agree with that. Inclusion of disabled people in their society, school or work, it's really important. But there are some legal or cultural historical backdrop against which we have decided to create a union of our own. These are the reasons. First of all, there were three legal achievements that motivate us to establish our union. The first one is obviously the promotion of employment of Disabled Persons Act that was passed back in 1990, and which was the first legal instrument that opened up the quota system in South Korea. And the second one is Anti-Discrimination Against Disability Act that was passed in 2008. And it was really pivotal in the disability movement in South Korea, because it requires all employers, including the government, to employ disabled people. And third one is obviously UNCRPD. UNCRPD Article 27 Article 27 states that the state parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities are able to exercise their labor and trade union rights on an equal basis with others. But there's another thing that motivates us to make the union of our own. That is, obviously, discrimination. For all those laws and international treaties, we still face discrimination in many forms in schools. So here we go. Back in 2019, we had a founding general meeting, and then we started our union. At the time of the foundation, there were 166 public teachers in Korea, but only 4,485 of them were disabled. So that accounts for only 1.32% of the public teachers. The number is not that higher now, so we have a long way to go. So what are we doing? There are 4 pillars of work we're doing. The first one is definitely the bargains with Ministry of Education and provincial offices of education. Just last year, we started the bargain with the Ministry of Education, and it's still ongoing. And the second thing we are working on is counseling with and advocacy for disabled teachers. Actually, this is the most important part of our work, but at the same time, it's the trickiest part because every disabled teacher has their own unique working environment and their unique colleagues and then unique needs. So we should address those issues just case by case. So there are many unexpected or unpredicted things that happen. And the third thing is making our voices heard in society. So we do interviews on YouTube, radio, TV, or you raise our voices on social media. We use all means we can to voice our frustrations, sometimes welcome to the social changes. And lastly, we build networks and partnerships with other disability groups. The first disability group that we made partnership with was an organization called AUD, Social Cooperative, which specializes in communication access, real-time translation. Because we have many different disabled teachers in our union, we had to equip ourselves with these services. And let me share some funny episode while we were preparing to make this union. We had a lot of meetings, and one day after meeting, we had burgers for dinner, and there were 4 blind teachers and 1 deaf teacher and another physically disabled teacher. And we were having fun talking about what were going on in our unions. And then can you guess what happened? The deaf teacher was mad at us. He was so angry because he had no idea what we were talking about. And he was very angry and he just left us. We were at the burger place near the Seoul station, and it was very late at night. And then the 4 blind people, the 4 blind teachers there had no idea how to get back to the station. So we started sending apology messages to the deaf teacher, but he was so mad that he didn't reply. So it took him like 2 days to come down and then return to us. So anyway, from that time on, we always have the translation service for deaf or hard of hearing teachers in our union meetings. And the second group that we have a strong connection with is Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination, which is definitely one of the most powerful and largest network of disability activists. So we do some joint press conferences or joint demonstration for the passing of bills. So what are the goals of our union? Obviously, it's making the schools inclusive for all. As I mentioned earlier, there are huge discrepancies between the laws and reality. So it's our job to reduce those gaps. And there are also a lot of different people with different disabilities in schools, students, teachers, or students' parents, or sometimes even principals or vice principal. So our job is to ensure that people with disabilities can do their jobs no matter what disabilities they have. So our goal is to make our schools more disability friendly and more inclusive. To conclude, what does 함께 mean? 함께 Union of Disabled Teachers, it's our full name. And 함께 means in Korean, together. So we wanted to convey the message of togetherness and inclusion in our name instead of giving out some boring, meaningless words. So we put this special word in our name, and then hopefully hopefully my speech and our work at our union can inspire some disabled teachers and disabled students all over the world. Thank you very much. You can contact us at the emails or social media like Facebook page. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kim, for explaining why you created the Union of Disabled Teachers, what you have been doing, as well as what your goals are. And the funny story, although it is a sad story, but it gives us strong message that we need to work together, especially among differently abled persons with disabilities. Thank you very much for your presentation. The next panelist is Ms. Sylvia Kwan, former Vice Chair of the CRPD, who will talk about right to education of persons with disabilities and the COVID-19 pandemic. Ms. Kwan, you have the floor. You have about 8 minutes too.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you very much to DPI Korea for inviting me to this very important side event. I wish, first of all, to greet Excellencies and all the dear participants who are here today. I wish also to send my warm greetings to Miju Kim, my dear friend from Korea and former colleague in the CRPD committee. Inclusive education should be considered in the first place as a human right, as a fundamental human right. The CRPD committee has recognized it in its general comment number 4 adopted in 2016 in relation to Article 24 of the CRPD. And I think that when we talk about inclusive education, and everybody who is working to make inclusive education a reality should address it as such and make it a binding legal obligation for all states who have ratified the CRPD. But as the chair of the CRPD committee has said in her video, inclusive education is not only for learners with disabilities, it's actually for all. If inclusive education were a reality, nobody would be left behind in education. So starting with this idea, inclusive education should be seen also as in opposition to the old models of segregated education, like special schools and other type of schooling, like residential schooling, special classrooms for disabled children, and so on. Segregated settings and special education, which I would say is still the most the majorly schooling for children with disabilities in the world, still does not ensure quality education and the same contents as other children that are not in those settings. Inclusive education and mainstream schooling is not only positive because it's for all, but because it should reflect the composition of society as it is, we know, and humanity with all its diversity. So inclusive education has all kinds of and all diversity of learners. So we have children with disabilities, but we also have children that have different type of family settings, that come from different kind of migratory status, that have different social and economical and economic background. So inclusive education should be a reflect of society and its diversity. So all learners that are learning in an inclusive education setting will grow used to seeing society as diverse as the world is. So in that sense, disability should not be seen as something different, something that should be treated differently as the rest. And that is why it is positive. That is the biggest value that inclusive education can provide. But what has happened since COVID-19 pandemic was declared? One of the most serious consequences since the pandemic began is that there has been a very significant backslash to the advancements of inclusive education, especially in the poorest countries, in the developing world. In general terms, isolation for learners with disability has increased. Social distancing and other measures for the protection of COVID-19 have made learners with disabilities have more barriers to access whatever schooling they were accessing before the pandemic. But even for those that were still attending special education, the pandemic has created these conditions for them to be even more isolated than before, because even special schools have closed, and many of the learners all over the world are still not attending school, even if slowly the world is reopening and building back. Then service provisions that were in some way linked to education for learners with disabilities, such as health, therapies, rehabilitation, were usually suspended suspended with the pandemic. And isolation has also provoked that learners with disabilities have more difficulties than if they received these services in whatever school setting they were in, that they do not receive it anymore. And that means that not only their education process has stopped, or maybe it's going backwards, but also other issues relating, for example, to their physical health or to mental health or to their language or speech therapies or whatever other services that they were also receiving in the schooling settings have stopped. And many learners with disabilities have also have these services. I mean, their non-access to these services has also have consequences in their individual conditions relating to their disabilities specifically. So some good practices, not very many, that we have seen, especially I will focus myself in the developing world, as I live in in a developing country, and I'm more familiar with this kind of settings, is that some very few good practices have come out in relation to producing materials, for example, in accessible formats. So Braille, for example, has been a very important tool for blind children, but also materials that have been produced in sign language for deaf children. However, it is important to say that usually deaf children, blind children, and children with physical disabilities only are the children who are usually included in mainstream schooling and inclusive education. So we're still leaving the most marginalized behind. In addition, regarding the isolation, learners with disabilities, more than other type of learners, need contact with people. And that is something that was necessary, to which they had access while having any kind of schooling. Of course, inclusive education was the best, and that daily contact with other learners, with their peers without disabilities and others, people like teachers and other persons that were part of the schooling community, were very important as a daily basis and as a daily growing up and developing as people within the society. So some good practices also that have been put into practice lately during the pandemic is that some teachers have taken the time to make home visits and to make very small groups of learners with disabilities so that they still have that contact with other people, which of course they really need. Then relating to the consequences of COVID, is that because homeschooling has become the general in most parts of the world, parents have difficulties also following on their children's education remotely, as parents usually have other tasks relating to either their work or also home-related tasks that are not necessarily linked to providing follow-up to their children's education. So I know that I have a short time, so I will try to finish. States have this obligation, and most states in the world, with a very few exceptions, have ratified CRPD. So the right to inclusive education is a binding, have binding obligations related to that as a result of CRPD ratification. And of course, all the measures that have been adopted while the COVID pandemic has been going on are not a justification to stop providing or to stop moving forward with inclusive education. And finally, but not least, I also take into my words one of the ideas that was exposed by my predecessor, saying that persons with disabilities, learners with disabilities, and their representative organizations should be taken into account when developing strategies, programs, and any kind of issue relating to the compliance of inclusive education, whether we're in the pandemic or whether we're building back from the pandemic. I think that this is something that all states should never forget. So nothing about us without us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sylvia Kwan, for raising this inclusive education as essential human rights. And you explained how COVID-19 pandemic brought very negative effects upon the rights of persons with disabilities, and especially when services were suspended or inaccessible. But you also showed us some good examples so that we can have hope in this difficult time, including the difficulties in the family. And you reminded us the duties of the state parties to CRPD. Thank you very much. And our next panelist is Ms. Elizabeth Ruabu, who will talk about disability inclusive international cooperation projects in the field of education between Republic of Korea and Uganda. Ms. Ruabu, you have about 8 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Rabu from Uganda. I hope you're able to hear me. I'm happy to be part of this forum on disability rights and education. I'm going to be presenting on a topic that we carried out, a project on disability inclusive international collaboration in the field of education. Sorry. About me, persons with disabilities advocate. I'm a teacher who has this particular passion in helping children with disabilities, especially in the inclusive setting. I'm also a fellow on the International Leaders in Education program, and currently I'm a program director for Early Years Count Uganda. In my presentation, I'll just talk a bit about the introduction. I'll have the timeline in which we carried out our project, our achievements, the pandemic challenge, the areas of improvement, our next steps, conclusion, and our acknowledgements. Activists from South Korea and Uganda met in 2018. And during that time, at the beginning of 2018, we were able to do a mapping and situational analysis about persons with disability in Uganda. And because we're preparing for a project, we actually got the following findings. In Uganda, about 16% of the population have some form of disabilities. And of these, about 5.82%, that is about 2,027,148 children have some form of disability. And this is a statistic taken from 2016. Now, despite the high numbers of people with disabilities, we find that the children with disabilities still having a problem with accessing education and completing school. The dropout rate is very high, and enrollment in school and completion is really a very, very big challenge. And therefore, we have this very big gap, which the activists from South Korea and Uganda decided to come up and try to mitigate. And in this, we actually looked at an awareness project, which was speaking to the Article 24 of the UN CRPD. So we worked in collaboration with teachers, lecturers, advocates, and the kind of activities we came up with were involved teacher workshops. We published some storybooks. We designed some video content. And then we had several meetings back and forth with special education administrators. This project was sponsored by the Ministry of Health and Welfare in South Korea, and CODI, ILEP Uganda, RIDRIC, International Development Institute Uganda, and we had other several partners, which who are basically NGOs in Uganda that actually are speaking to persons with disability. Some of the pictures here show the kind of work we tried to do, and the placards we were putting in schools, but these placards were actually worked out by the students and teachers themselves to create awareness in the different schools. Our work from 2018 to 2019 involved, we had a project theme, and our project theme was education for improving the awareness of disability and empowering teachers using fairytale books and video content. And this theme was actually taken to the northern part of Uganda, which is one of the areas that has been hit or has the highest number of people with disabilities. And the period in which we did this was about 5 months, from August to December. And then we carried out 2 days of teacher workshops. And this actually seemed to be very fruitful because we had 101 teachers in public primary schools stand up. And the impact of these 101 teachers in the different primary schools would actually reach out to 439 students in the different public schools in northern Uganda. While in northern Uganda, we actually cooperated with another non-government organization from Korea, and were able to work out these teacher workshops. So this is just a sharing of some of the topics that we actually spoke to. We spoke to disability inclusion. We spoke to laws and politics about disability. We spoke to understanding disability. We shared on disability rights and raising awareness. And here in this picture, we're having students, some of the children looking at the, reading the story, the stories that were actually printed out and created alongside the teachers in Uganda and those in South Korea. We actually have a fairytale, we actually printed about 3,000 fairytale books, which were supplied in different schools. And it was seen that some of these schools didn't even have textbooks or readers that the children would use. So the fairytale book was a book that really helped the children, first of all, understand English, but also continue to raise awareness and know that it is very possible to have children with disabilities in our community. And we must actually be aware and we must accommodate them. In 2019, we actually did another awareness program, and our theme was education for improving awareness of disability based on human rights for teachers and students in public schools. This was done in eastern part of Uganda, and still the months were August to December, which was about 5 months, and we had teacher workshops for about 4 days, which involved special needs administrators from the different communities. And we still shared this workshop, and we actually had a target of about 124 teachers in public primary schools. And this target of teachers made us reach up to 800 students in eastern part of Uganda. While in eastern part of Uganda, we identified a South Korean organization, which was called IDI, which we worked with. And the topics that we actually were speaking to were inclusive education, disability rights, understanding disability, laws and politics about disability, how to understand and deal with children with disability. We had several teachers in this, we had several activities and several demonstrations. Our kind of methodology involved teacher participation in everything that we were trying to speak to in regards to disability. So we had the teachers act out a fairy tale storybook, so that they would actually go back to their students and be able to bring this clearly out. And then in 2020, we were faced, of course, with a pandemic challenge, and we couldn't have the face-to-face workshops that we actually were having. So we had to change our awareness program to cater for all learners, but to also reach out to the different communities. And in this, we actually worked with the Ministry of Education, and we developed a kind of partnership. And in this partnership, we decided to develop education materials that would raise awareness on televisions and different televisions and radios in Uganda. So we had our achievements, so that we actually had part of what we had come up with between the Ministry of Education and Redrick. We actually had education materials which were printed out, and we also had some education materials that were supposed to be broadcasted through TV, different TVs in Uganda. So we signed a memorandum of understanding and were able to start doing something about trying to reach out and making the content accessible to all learners through TV and through radios. In conclusion, I would like to share what we actually did. In conclusion, we realized that our disability model of sharing what we had come up with different teachers in workshops, creating content, we found that this was really reaching out to many teachers, and it had a kind of multiplier effect. We definitely, based on the UNCRPD, and were able to address some of these challenges. Some of the teachers that were in these inclusive schools didn't know how to handle the children with disabilities, yet they had no option but to be in these particular classes because they couldn't go to the special needs schools that were way back in the capital city. So our training helped the teachers understand the best ways on how to help these learners and also how to accommodate them. We had a successful cooperation, signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Education. We worked with different non-government organizations, and we were able to reach out and see which gap we could actually combat. So currently, in Uganda right now, we are actually facing the second wave of COVID, and again, all schools are closed. This is already creating a very big challenge. Our counterparts in Rwanda have come up with a methodology where they actually are using TV, they're using radio to broadcast and share learning materials with all learners. For Uganda, we actually have also done this, but the challenge we are facing is that we are not able to have accessible content that can be accessed by the blind students, can be accessed by the deaf students. So we are actually seeing that there is a gap there which needs to be actually mitigated. So there are so many awareness programs going on, but when we look at the education material that is now being broadcasted through TV, there seems to be that gap. So the children with disabilities have actually been left out and they're not able to attend learning because they actually are supposed to be in the special needs school or in inclusive schools. And now that they are back home, you find that most of them are just left and they cannot attend to some of these programs. And also the other bit about it is that most of the children with disabilities, the greatest number, the percentage is really from families that are really poverty stricken. And for them to get to school, it's only possible because they have gotten some scholarships and something like that, or some NGOs are supporting their education. So we're having a very big challenge during this COVID time because the children with disabilities are actually missing out. Thank you so much. The contacts for this presentation are right here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rabu, for your presentation for inclusive education and good example of international cooperation between Uganda and Korea, and your efforts to trying to reach out and leaving no one behind, especially in the midst of challenges of COVID-19. Thank you for your good presentation. Our next panelist will be Mr. Oleg Kotashikov from Russian Federation, who will speak about inclusive education for persons with disabilities in hybrid method in the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Kotashikov, please, the floor is yours.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, dear colleagues, for having me. My name is Oleg Kolpashchikov. I'm from Russia, and I'm 48 years old. I'm blind. I'm the head of White Cane nonprofit organization. And for those who are blind, I want to describe myself. I'm a big man, king-size man, and I have a short hair. I have a short beard, a little bit gray. I'm a little bit smiling. I'm working from my home, and I wear now the shirt in a blue and white color. Yeah, this is for those who has a visual impairment. Okay. I will speak about the inclusive education and hybrid format. It's a mixture of online and offline. And we are speaking now about the inclusive education, and there is much developed all over the world, especially, how should I say it, in European and other countries. But the results of inclusive education, the research says that there are still some problems, and huge problems. For instance, our colleagues in Israel shared with us the research data that told us that 87% of parents of learners without disabilities don't want that their children will study with learners with disabilities. 87% in Israel. Yeah, can you imagine such figures? But on the one hand, it's awful. On the other hand, it's quite clear because we're just speaking about the inclusive education, not thinking about the people without disabilities in inclusive education. What they really could benefit from collaboration, from interaction with people with disabilities. We don't have a good research, we don't have good programs, but our organization is work on such a projects where where we show for all the participants of inclusive education and other inclusive projects what are real benefits for for every participant of inclusive interaction. Our organization, the aim of our organization that was founded 10 years ago is the mission of our organization. We create a world where all the people has an opportunity to develop their extra abilities, mean additional abilities. What is extra abilities? Extra abilities, this is additional abilities that are developed through limitation and active social life, active socialization. For example, blind people, they are much better in memory, in imagination, the feeling of trust. Also, the blind people has such a competence like tolerance to uncertainty. For example, deaf people are very good in emotional intelligence. People who are moving on wheelchair, they are very good in logistic skills, yeah. And we call it extra abilities. And extra abilities are developed and manifested through the inclusive interaction. And it's very important when we're thinking about, when we're planning different educational projects or other social projects with the people, not for people with disabilities, but with the people with disabilities. We are to focus on inclusive interaction, not only on accessibility, but we are focused on inclusive interaction. And we did a lot of projects, on-site projects before the pandemic that included inclusive interaction. When the pandemic started, it was a really tricky time for us because we knew how to do it in on-site, offline, yeah, but it was a big challenge for us how to organize the inclusive interaction in online format. And we challenged ourselves and start to try different projects, different experiments in order to find what are the best options in online or in hybrid format in which we can really have inclusive interaction, in which people really with disabilities and without disabilities, in which they get the opportunity to develop their mostly hidden talents and abilities. And we found several very interesting things. We will speak about, I will speak today not about the problems of the pandemic, but about the benefits, what we've got through pandemic. Because we really got very interesting projects and we've got the new opportunities to develop talents and abilities and to on international level, first of all, yeah. And one of the projects that really help us to activate the inclusive interaction in hybrid format is inclusive managerial fights. Inclusive managerial fights. This technology came from business. Business people trained how to solve the conflict situation, how to negotiate in this project. And we did this project inclusive. We started to learn people not how to solve the business situation, but how to solve different kinds of situation. And we modeled the conflicts between different social groups. The first respectful speaker said, did a very good situation about the conflict between deaf and blind people. And we do this, we model and we play these conflicts in online format. Also, for example, blind people and deaf people had the opportunity to try to solving these conflicts through the chat. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting when the representative of different cultures, they try to not only to solve the conflict, but just to enter, to understand what is going on, because the cultures are very different there, and the way of collaboration is very different. And this project is very interesting. It's not only about disabled people. We do this situation between people with disabilities and, for example, teachers, people don't know, from other social groups we involve in this project, the people who are, for example, overcoming different types of addiction. Yeah, this is the first one. The second one that I would like to share with you, the short description in the presentation, which my colleague Anna helps me to show you. The second project is inclusive playback theater. Playback theater also it is quite famous technique when the group of people helps one person to reflect his strong emotional situation by showing him like a theater, like a play. Yeah. And during the pandemic, we start trying how the representatives of different social groups can be empathic to reflect the situation, the way of thinking, the emotions of other social groups. For example, the people from business, one person from business share with his deep emotional situation, strong emotional situation, and the group, including people with disabilities, are showing him this situation like a theater, yeah. And it became also very useful and interesting technique where we have real inclusive interaction between the different social groups, where people could see another way of thinking, another way of dealing with emotion, and so on. And moving forward, we develop several types of such inclusive projects that we use like in additional education in schools, in universities. And in the end of 2020, we organized the conference Extrability like a Phenomenon of Inclusive Culture, in which we spoke about how to build, how to create the inclusive culture in the digital space. We shared with these techniques with each other, with the participants of the conference. On the one hand, on the other hand, we started the new standard of inclusive academic conferences. We asked all the presenters to organize inclusive interaction in each presentation. So it was our rule of the conference that it must be inclusive interaction in each presentation, in each activity, yeah, of the conference. First, we did in 2020 in Ural Federal University in Yekaterinburg. The second part we did finished a week ago in Israel, in David Yalin Pedagogic College. And the next conference will be also in the Ural Federal University in the end of December of this year. And we invite all of you to share your interesting and positive and effective strategies, how we can include the people with disabilities, how the people with disabilities could be really useful. And in the end, I would say a couple of slogans in the end. First of all, what about the people with disabilities? Sometimes we need help, but we really can be useful. And that's why we want to switch this famous slogan, nothing for us without us, to the new one, nothing for the society without us. We want to be helpful, and we want to be useful, and we want to think not only about the rights, but about our opportunities, responsibilities, and so on, that will make us really equal. Thank you very much for the Redrick institution that invited us here to this very interesting conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kolpashkov for your presentation. I learned some new terminology, extrability, inclusive interaction, and also learned about your good projects, inclusive managerial fights, inclusive playback theater, as well as inclusive academic conference. And your new slogan, nothing for the society without us. Thank you very much. Okay, our final panelist, Mr. Hwai-Tiak Lim. Thank you for waiting so long, but you are not the least, of course. And you will talk about strategy and principle to ensure the right of education of persons with disabilities in the pandemic. And I believe you are joining from Singapore. So Mr. Lim, the floor is yours. Also, he's a board member of International Disability Alliance, IDA. Please go ahead.
Thank you and good morning from Singapore. I've been asked to talk about the strategy and principle to ensure the right education of persons with disabilities in the present pandemic. I think it's needless to say that persons with disabilities are adversely affected during this pandemic. And while the COVID-19 pandemic threatens all members of society, persons with disabilities are disproportionately impacted due to attitudinal, environmental, and institutional barriers that are reproduced in the COVID-19 safe management measures. These barriers include accessing healthcare and information, accessing livelihood and income support, participating in online education, and seeking protection from violence. Persons with disabilities who are prisoners and who are homeless or without adequate housing face even greater risks. Talking about leaving no one behind, I think we all know that all societies, including people who are marginalized and facing difficulties accessing public information and services for themselves, have a lot of variety of reasons why they are excluded. These reflect entrenched discrimination, exclusion, inequality, or political divide, not mentioning the more recently pronounced digital divide. COVID-19 information and resource efforts must be disability inclusive. This would include those such as national, ethnic, or religious minorities, indigenous people, migrants, displaced persons and refugees, older persons, persons with disabilities, women, LGBTIQ people, children, or people affected by extreme poverty. These are all the people who face such great discrimination. What we can do is that we must ensure that national human rights institutions, civil societies, and local communities can assist in identifying people who may otherwise be missed or excluded, supporting the flow of accessible information to these groups, and providing feedback to the authorities on how these measures impact these communities. What are the impacts of COVID-19 on the right of education of persons with disabilities? Persons with disabilities are less likely than others to complete education and more likely to be excluded altogether from schooling. Some of the exclusion that the students with disabilities are facing include absence of required equipment, no access to internet, no access to accessible materials and support necessary to permit them to follow online school programs. As a result, many students with disabilities are being left behind, particularly students with intellectual disabilities who might not be able to understand the concepts that are behind it. So certain instruction and information have to be made simpler for them to understand. There are some promising practices in the community, and here is one example of in USA how they use the Individuals and Disabilities Education Act to help them. In UK and Northern Ireland, they disseminated information and established systems to support parents and caregivers to guide them on completing responsibilities while at home and to better support the educational process of children with disabilities. What are some of the key actions that member states and other stakeholders can participate in? Firstly, provide clear guidance to education and school authorities on the scope of the obligations and the variety of available resources when providing education outside schools. Ensure internet access for remote learning and that software is accessible to persons with disabilities, including through the provision of assistive devices and reasonable accommodation. Provide guidance, training, and support for teachers on inclusive education through remote learning. Establish close coordination with parents and caregivers for early education of children with disabilities. Provide guidance and distance support for parents and caregivers, including equipment, and to support education programs of children with disabilities. We also need to develop accessible and adapted materials for students with disabilities to support remote or online learning. In Singapore, we call this home-based learning, HBL. We also need to develop accessible educational audio visual materials to disseminate through the major social media, and this should include online on demand, televised educational programs, etc. Here are some resources that we can look onto from UNICEF for some of the responses on our considerations for people with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Lim, for your good, excellent presentations. Now I hope that we can have a little bit of time for questions and answers, although we surpassed the time. And I see in the chat section and also Q&A section some questions from Costa Rica, a person whose name is Mariana Camacho, who asked two questions. First question is there any good practices related to family members' support with virtual classes? And I think that Mr. Lim just explained what obligations and what things need to be done for the families with children with disabilities. But if there is anybody who add some more, what are good practices in giving support to families with children with disabilities? And the next question is to Russian presenter. Is there a website to learn more about the conference methodology, the inclusive academic conference he mentioned? So we'll take these two questions first and to see whether there is any more questions. So Mr. Lim, would you like to add some more?
I can't say much about the other ASEAN countries because each ASEAN country have its own unique way of dealing with special education. But in Singapore, we do place a lot of emphasis on a tripartite approach. That is the people, public, and private sector cooperation. So we involve a great deal of support, not only between the family and the schools, as well as the public sector is concerned. We also try to cultivate a culture where family support is encouraged and perhaps even sometimes even incentivized. So I think during these pandemic times, when it becomes very necessary for schools to be closed as part of the COVID safety management measures, many children are left at home and with their parents or their caregivers, and the only way in which they can access education is through remote learning or online learning. So our Ministry of Education has a very robust and dynamic program whereby they uses home-based learning to continue with all the curriculum, as well as the touch points whereby students can be allowed to continue the curriculum that is needed for them to complete their education. For special education schools, often we need to have this extra element whereby support has to be given, because sometimes children, perhaps those with the ASD, with autism, they face extra difficulties in adjusting to their regime of being left isolated at home. And we do have social service agencies that will reach out to families and especially on how they can better handle the children with special needs during these times. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Lim. And I believe that Mr. Kolpashkov answered in the chatting box that he gave the website where you can get more information about the conference methodology. So that will do. And let's see, there is another question from a person named Omnia Fazi. Very comprehensive question. What are the most effective strategies and materials which can make the education process works effectively? Anybody who would like to answer this question? Most effective strategies and materials which can make the education process works effectively. I think it's a very comprehensive question, and that will need another Zoom meeting and another conference and panels. Okay. There is appreciation from Costa Rica for the website information and examples. Thanking you. All right. And also there was an earlier request whether this recorded session can be approachable, and a request to send the recorded session to email, through email from Omnia. Yes, the same person. All right. Now, if there are no more questions, we'll ask Mr. Lee Yong-seok for some closing remark about this panel. Mr. Lee?
예. 안녕하십니까. 저는 CRPD NGO 연대의 간사단체를 맡고 있는 한국장애인연맹의 정책실장 이용석이고요. 이번 사이드 이벤트를 기획한 사람입니다. 오늘 여러분들이 오셔서 팬데믹 상황에서의 장애인 통합교육에 대한 문제를 다 짚어주셨는데요. 실제로 제가 이 사이드 이벤트를 기획할 의도는 현재의 그 팬데믹 상황에서의 장애인 통합교육 체제가 어떻게 쉽사리 무너질 수밖에 없는 상황이 되어버렸는지, 그리고 거기에 대한 대응은 우리가 어떻게 그 대응을 맞이할 수 있는지를 좀 더 촘촘하게 논의를 하고 싶어서였습니다. 특히 이제 실비아 칸께서 말씀하신 통합교육은 장애뿐만 아니라 인종이나 기타 다양한 환경에 사는 구성원들이 만날 수 있는 아주 유일하고 중요한 인적 네트워크라는 말에 저도 대단히 감명을 받았는데요. 그렇기 때문에 팬데믹 상황에서의 그 중단 없는 교육 환경을 장애인들에게 제공하는 것은 매우 중요하다 할 것입니다. 저희 장애인 연맹은요, 오늘 사이드 이벤트로 끝나는 게 아니라 올해 1년 동안 중단 없는 장애인의 교육 환경 마련을 위한 국제적인 컨퍼런스를 또다시 준비하고 있습니다. 그래서 현재 지금 각 국가나 우리나라에서도 논의되고 있는 비대면 수업권, 장애인들이 비대면으로도 수업을 받을 수 있는 권리를 어떻게 법적으로 보장할 수 있는지에 대한 여부도 저희가 좀 따져볼 예정이고요. 앞으로도 이러한 상황이 계속 지속되고, 그다음에 포스트 코로나 시대 이후에도 여전히 장애인들이 교육 환경에서 배제되고 분리되는 상황을 어떻게 저희가 막을 수 있고 좀 더 교육권을 보장받을 수 있는지 여부를 논의할 예정입니다. 앞으로 저희가 하는 이런 컨퍼런스나 이런 준비들에 대해서 오늘 참여하시던 모든 각 국가의 스피커분들이 다시 한번 참여해 주셔서 저희들이 우리와 함께 전 세계 장애인들의 교육권을 제대로 보장받을 수 있는데 일조를 해 주셨으면 고맙겠습니다. 그리고 오늘 각자 각 국가별로 시간이 다른데요. 그럼에도 불구하고 참여해 주셔서 아주 심도 있는 논의를 해주신 모든 분들께 대단히 감사드립니다. 그리고 자장님 너무 고생 많이 하셨습니다. 예, 감사합니다.
Thank you, Mr. Lee Yong-suk, for explaining, as an organizer of this event, explaining how important inclusive education is as human rights, especially during the pandemic, and also your ongoing efforts to organize this kind of event forward in the near future this year. I have really enjoyed excellent presentations from 5 panelists showing the various aspects of inclusive education, from the teacher's perspective and from the human rights perspective, and all the difficulties during the pandemic, but also some good examples regarding to reach out to those and include everybody without leaving nobody in this difficult times. So I thank you on behalf of the organizers again for this excellent panel, and I hope that inclusive education will be realized for everybody in the near future, not so long. And thank you very much for the panelists, for the organizers, for those who are involved, and thank you very much for all.